Patrick Johnston, here we are.
Look at you and me, both in sweater, like zip-up sweaters, three-quarter zips.
It's the dad uniform. It's a little cold in the office here today. Happy to be in the office, by the way. I got my lovely vintage Canuck programs behind me. Let's start off Canucks This Week by telling you that this is brought to you by Woody's RV, woodysrv.com. Biggest selection of RV vehicles in Western Canada, and always some good deals to be had there. Hey, if you want to get out of town, like Bo Horvat. Look, this is a weekly podcast, so obviously the Canucks are playing Bo Horvat momentarily this afternoon. We don't know what will happen. What I would like to talk to you about with Patrick is it's kind of a weird day. Like, we've seen the NBA is insane. Like Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, like
John Wall.
Big teams, Westbrook, like just like names, the biggest names going everywhere, all over the place. The Horvat deal is significant. I'm not downplaying it at all. It's massive. We did see the Rangers trade for Tarasenko. Maybe it's the salary cap. Maybe it's the conservative nature of hockey culture versus some other sports. But teams don't necessarily seem to want to be in on the blockbuster like they used to. But having said that, as I acknowledge, the Canucks did trade away their captain, largely for cap reasons. Do you sense that there's significant business left to be done for the Vancouver Canucks? Because the Rangers deal, to me, at least opens the door a little bit to the fact there are teams out there who are willing to do business if they feel it'll get them somewhere.
I think so. I mean, one of the main points that's been going here in general has been what you've already, lack of cap space. Now, that is going to change. One of the things about the reality of the NHL cap is that, it's about accruing space. It's about being able to build out what you have left to spend in the year, right? Because it's a budget for the year. It's not a budget for any given day. So what we're waiting to see basically is teams are in a spot to do that now. I think that's part of what we're talking about. That's why the Horvat trade happened when it did. That things were starting to happen. They were starting to be able to have some discussions. Tarasenko is the same kind of thing. We still have 3 weeks to go until the deadline, give or take. 3 weeks, because Friday, 3 weeks on Friday. So, we're going to see, I think, a slow trickle. Now, in the end, the structural thing is that the NBA, it's, one guy can change so much for your team that is why we see the high valuation of adding players like the way they do. But there also, in general, is a more risk-taking league. Like, we've seen this. I think, was it Blake Murphy pointed out, like, there's been 44 second-round picks moved, something like that.
There's not too many things more worthless than a second-round NBA pick.
In the NBA, but you know what I mean, right? Like
I do know.
So there is some sort of currency there that teams are interested in. So I think the truth remains the Canucks would like to move. Will probably end up moving. Certainly we'll try to move Brock Boeser. And Luke Schenn is going to be a hot commodity. I think the way he sort of reinvigorated his game, the story's been told so many times. So the way he's reinvigorated his game in the last 4 years has made him a commodity that is really interesting. And I've said it time and again, he's a guy that does seem to understand how to throw hits. I don't think it's that complicated, but throw hits that are effective and useful and while also being able to handle the puck and do all the things you need from sort of the modern defenseman, despite the fact that he came up in a different game. So, those are the two main guys I think we're looking at. There's always the possibility of something else happening. Obviously, there's been all this noise about a Demko trade. We'll see if that actually happens. They need him to play. They need him to play well, even if that's going to be a possibility. I'm not sure how convinced I am actually that happening. But yeah, I think the Canucks are not. I don't think they're anywhere near done, and I do think there's going to be more things coming.
So just on the Schenn point, I've read a fair bit, both fan opinion and stuff that you've written, Ben, various other people. I see both sides of the argument. People point out that when there are team building activities, and there are a lot of people, whether you believe the whispers or not, you're probably a lot closer to this than most people who comment on it, whether you believe the whispers or not, there's a bit of either a culture or a chemistry issue in that locker room, that this group isn't particularly tight. I personally subscribe to the feeling that winning cures a lot of that stuff. You've got guys who are willing to tolerate guys on their team that they don't like if they're winning. But there's this, I have seen this argument put forward that Schenn is the guy who will bring the families together for a social gathering, will pump up guys in the room. He's certainly a guy who's dropped the gloves when the team needs some energy. Is that worth keeping around? Assuming you're burning it to the ground, he doesn't cost a lot of money. I know I don't want to go down the thank you Jim road of Jay Beagle and Roussel and like character guys overpaying for them, to teach the young guys that the young guys obviously learn nothing because the team's worse now than it was when they went on that road. But there is something about having a guy, the glue guys they talk about, to bring everyone together. Having said that, he's not, when this team looks like they're going to be finally ready to compete, it's not like he's going to be a major contributor by that point. So which side of this do you fall on? Is how much value is there in keeping him, and how much value is in there and saying, look, let's take what we can get?
I think for all the sort of day-to-day culture value that might be there, I think you've kind of answered it already. I mean, you don't want to get stuck up in overvaluing that. Now, certainly they're not overpaying him for that, which is in a certain level a counter to the idea that you need to just completely ignore that. He is a good value player on your team, and he is good for your team in terms of attitude and character and all that.
He's also a Rick Tocchet style player.
Yeah, very much so. I just think at the end of the day, you need to recognize what's in front of you, the task at hand, and that they certainly need to find players, younger players for the future. Now, obviously, when you're filling out that part of the roster, it doesn't have to be a young guy. That he is, if deployed correctly, he is exactly the player you need. But he in the end is a guy that just you're gonna have to move on from. I think you can always bring him back, but in the moment you're going to get a draft pick for him, and that's important.
It's one of the things that does strike me about where the Canucks are right now. Two names that you brought up, Demko and Boeser. 3 years ago, you would have got a haul for those two guys. You're really, really at the low end of the market. Is there any chance that the Canucks hang on to those guys and try and use them as pieces going forward?
I always think there's a chance. I mean, but Brock Boeser is very useful hockey player. That's the thing. He's not the elite sniper, but he's a second line winger, right? Like, he's a guy that makes your team better by being in the lineup. So there's certainly a case for that. I just think we look at where they're at, the decisions they've made. The decision to keep Kuzmenko was a statement about how they feel about how he plays versus what they want, what they weren't. And I don't, I think that is in the end that's a Boeser decision. Going down the long run. I mean, I don't think Jonathan Lekkerimäki is going to be in the lineup anytime soon, but he's a guy that you would hope would replace Brock Boeser in the lineup at this point, or going forward, I should say. You need to think about these sorts of things. They don't have a ton of prospects, admittedly. There's no obvious heir apparent to what he does, but Niels Höglander, assuming that Niels Höglander's in their plans, they need to find a space for Niels Höglander in the lineup. The list goes on, and you can see on and on why I think their interest is moving on from Boeser. Now, I've said time and again, I think he is a guy that you do want to keep, and so from that standpoint, it could certainly happen. I'm just not convinced, and I think the reality is that once that December moment happened, that he was going to get scratched, and the sort of the frustrations perhaps that he'd been feeling started to boil over a little bit. And we found out that, essentially that they were talking about letting the agent find a trade. The writing's kind of been on the wall. I think we're just at that point now. It's
just such a shame, and I know it was a different regime, but again, the value that the stock in Demko and Boeser at one point, especially also both being American players, when you talk about marketability with the teams that you're looking at, it's really high Like I think that when you look at like dealing from a position of weakness, as you said, if to me the only way, like who's trading for Demko at this point, because he was disappointing before he got hurt. Clearly his worst year in a Vancouver Canucks uniform, even when he was healthy. So, you know, I think if he's still a piece you want to move, you might want to wait until next year and have him prove it a little bit on the ice before you get there. But it seems without them saying it, we've seen publicly, we talk about, no, we're not rebuilding. This is a retool. There's things that we want to do. Their actions are speaking louder than their words right now. I do want to put it to you. It's interesting. The only team in the NHL with a worse record in the last 10 games is the St. Louis Blues. Now, the immediate, they've lost 5 in a row, but over the last 10, the Canucks have the worst, the Blues are just one loser point worse than the Canucks in the last 10. It looks like they're pushing in the chips. There's the Bedard factor. There's the fact it's a deep draft. You're seeing teams now say, okay, here we go. The problem with that, the trade deadline, as you know, is the teams that want your players are typically going to be drafting at the top end of the draft, but draft capital is always good. So where do you think despite what they've said publicly, looking at their actions, where do you think this management group are in terms of looking at what this team is, what they want to do, and how much surgery do you think we're going to see here? Already traded the captain, already changed the coach, not just up until the trading deadline, Patrick, but into the offseason. What can Canuck fans expect for this next sort of 8 months?
Well, I think the desire is obvious. You can just read into what's been said already. Patrick Allvin, one of the items that came up before we broke for the All-Star break, the last time we had Rick talking here in person, was finding a way to, first of all, manage Oliver Ekman-Larsson and Tyler Myers, manage their situations better. They've had a tough year. They're both older players. They don't move as well or make decisions as well as perhaps they used to. One of the interesting things is OEL is actually playing more now than he was. Couldn't use
someone has to,
but I think there was sort of a sense, and I asked Allvin and I asked Tocchet about this, and there was a sense of, well, a bit more structure probably is going to help them. At least that's their theory. But also Allvin acknowledged, yes, you know what, we have a lot of older right shot defensemen, which was Myers and Schenn. They obviously, they traded for Ethan Bear. They've been pretty happy with him, the way he's performed. But there's just, as I've already said, there's just not a lot of prospects in general. Jet Wu is not going to make it. There's just not a lot out there. So that is so clearly a target that they need to find some defensemen. And they're obviously very hopeful on Aatu Räty in the chance that he could be, essentially a second line center. There's some work to do there for that to happen, but that's certainly something I think they really feel strongly about. And then, JT Miller is obviously on this team too, and he's going to be, at least the plan is that he's going to be number one center. I think he is in that never say never category. Like, there is a chance that maybe he does end up somewhere else. But as we understand it, certainly he's a player that they see as part of the future. So, in the end, it's all about reshaping the stuff around the guys that are the focus, which is Elias Pettersson and Quinn Hughes. And that is very much what I think, we're going to be grading management's performance on, and certainly what fans should be looking for and fans should be asking for.
You brought up OEL and Myers, and it was a point I was going to get to, but just sort of screaming in the back of my head was, we've been doing these podcasts, videos, podcasts for a while, and I remember
Paul.
I remember in our old building at 200 Granville when Ed Willis was prior to his retirement. And I remember talking to you and Ed about what the issue was with this team when you're building the team. Again, this was under Jim Benning, and just Ed's screech, Jesus Christ, it's the blue line, and it's still the blue line. How do you fix this? Because you will hear, Quinn Hughes is an exception, but getting a defenseman to step in takes much longer than a forward. And yet here we are. We did talk about OEL and Myers, but we're talking about Boeser. We're talking about Ratsu. We're talking about, keeping Pedersen happy and Kuzmenko and trading Boeser. Like, it's all about the forwards still. And yet we know that you were writing this incessantly in the offseason. This team's blue line is not NHL standard, and it's still not. Yes, Bear has helped a little bit. I know there's salary cap issues, but is this, I wanted to ask you, is this why we hear about prospects and NHL-ready players more than purely draft picks? Because if you're just going to go purely draft picks with your defensemen, you may age out on your forwards before they're ready to play.
Well, yeah, yes. I mean, if you really are trying to build a team with Elias Pettersson, the center of it, you need it to be good in 2 years. Like, that's the thing. Like, you're talking about 24-25 as being a season where you're truly like banking into something. And you kind of nailed it right there. I mean, we talk about the cap, and the cap is the problem. The problem with the cap is OEL and Myers, and who brought those guys in? Jim Benning, who had a terrible record assessing defensemen. They drafted Quinn Hughes, and the rest is junk. There was the development's been a problem here, but I think the base for the most part for certainly 14, 15, 16, his first 3 drafts, they're just wasted rolls of the dice on defensemen who, I think even scouts at the time would have said, I don't know if there's much of a chance. I mean, low draft picks after the first round are always going to be always a major roll of the dice. You have to nail your first round ones. And the fact that they screwed up with Olio Levy, is such a statement. Again, like, there's another guy that didn't work out, could have, should be playing on a role on this team right now, but didn't, and so you look at the draft this year with those 2 draft picks, and you certainly go, that second pick, which is probably going to be at like 12 or 13, depending on what happens with the Islanders, of course. But if they draft twice this summer, that second pick without a doubt is going to be a defenseman, and it could be a defenseman who's good enough to be in the NHL in 2 seasons in 24-25. And so that is very much where they're at. But you're right. Like, the discussion has entirely been about forwards because that's all they have. There's just not a lot to make work. And so, we'll see how things play out, but certainly, yeah, if you can find, a quote unquote NHL ready defenseman for Brock Boeser, that certainly changes the dial. I think, that the names that we've often heard about when we look at, the Canucks obviously being interested in moving Boeser, moving Garland. Last summer we were talking about the Devils, and I certainly think there was something on the table involving the Devils and the Canucks and like David Severson. I think there's been interest from the Canucks in a number of Devils players. So maybe that yet happens. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, certainly. It is kind of everything at this point. They've got a pretty solid group of forwards, even without Bo Horvat. But they need the task is obvious. Like I said, they're going to need to find some defensemen.
So let me ask you this: if you literally trace back, and I'm not even pointing the finger at any GMs because we've heard our theories as to what comes from ownership here, but. If you go back over the last, say, 10 years, the Canucks haven't been able to help themselves from kind of leaping at free agents. Now, free agency, it's not always a dead end, but in a lot of cases it is.
Right.
Free agency in the NHL is you're overpaying for a bigger name. Very interesting to see Erik Karlsson bounce back, though, and but I mean, we'd heard the Canucks were interested in that. But
Karlsson acquired in a trade, right? Like that's
no, I know that. I'm just saying that like there was a ton of interest from the Canucks apparently in Karlsson for a couple of off seasons, and whether they were going to take a run at them in a trade or a free agency, the Canucks have sort of been attracted in the offseason to the big name, to making the big move, to making the big splash. Do you see them active at all this summer that way? I mean, it is a way to accelerate rather than just doing through the draft or younger prospects, but they've really not been able to avoid the impulse buy when they're sitting there at the checkout and you see something that you probably shouldn't spend your money on, but you're going to anyway.
Yeah, I think I mean, we know this ownership has been wanting to be in the middle of the discussion on in free agency for a decade.
Always, yeah.
So that's absolutely a factor. And I think, there's a belief here that, again, if they can find their way out from the Myers and OEL deals, that they can make use of that cap space. Yeah, absolutely. There are players that they are going to want to pursue. Now, does that mean, just because you're interested in pursuing a player in free agency doesn't mean you're interested in signing a blue chip free agent. It's all about how you frame it. And so I've got to think that there's still nonetheless a way that they will turn around and say, listen, no, we're not going for that guy. We're not going for this guy. We're not going for that guy, but we're going for these guys over here. A little bit of the old Moneyball discussion. We're not looking to replace Giambi. We're not looking to replace, his home runs directly. We're looking to figure out these three guys are gone, and this is what they bring to the table, and this is how we're going to recreate them. Recreate them in the aggregate, as Billy Bean said. I think there is an element of that, and it's harder to do that in hockey because there just isn't as much of sort of free talent, if you will, anymore, or underused talent or misjudged talent. But certainly that would be the MO, and it will not surprise me to see them active this summer.
Before we get to the summer, before we get to the trade deadline, there's games to play. So we do this every week. Islanders, Red Wings, Rangers in the next 6 days. How many of these games do they win?
I'm going to say 2.
There we go. Every time. You're split down the middle every time. It's going to be.
Let me just explain. I have a hard time. I mean, they're not going to sweep all 4. There's just no doubt about that. But they're playing well enough that that they should win at least one of those games just on merit, and then perhaps steal one. We'll see. That's kind of what I'm thinking. I don't, so 1 is most likely, 3 is unlikely, 2 is very possible.
It is. We've talked all year. The theme, the games are weird. Like this has been an interesting team to follow, as bad as they are. Monday night's game is a perfect example. 3 goals in 50 seconds. They could have rolled over. They didn't. They fought back. Close game last night against the Rangers, and you hear Rick talk about it. Like frustrated with the mistakes, but I think potentially happy with some of the spirit, at least from some of the team. Maybe not all of it. So I would say Canuck fans have to be encouraged, at least in terms of the effort putting in. Because when we talk about tanking, you're never really talking about guys losing on purpose. No. It's about icing a lineup that can't really compete, but maybe gives you some experience to some younger players, et cetera, et cetera. There's some teams in the NHL who are doing that very well right now. But I always ask you about the next week because that's immediate for us. But I'm really curious over the next 4 weeks to see how this team's going to set itself up in terms of, does it make any more moves, and what are we seeing on the ice?
And that's certainly something. I mean, I'm going to be writing about it probably Friday, and so maybe you're watching this video with that story. But essentially, looking at Tocchet himself coming in as that new fresh set of eyes, with a month to. I mean, we got, like I said, 3 weeks to go to deadline now, but he came in, with just over a month or 6 weeks to go until the deadline, and the management knows what they think, but they would be smart. I think they would be. This is their guy. This is their coach now, a coach that they appreciate and they understand. They would be wise to sort of ask him, okay, what have you found out? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And that as much as anything, that's what the next until the deadline is also going to be about. Is just sort of trying to figure out how are they thinking and what are they thinking and where do they think they want to go with all these guys.
Great stuff, Patrick. We'll let you go. I know we got a game looming. You go to woodiesrv.com, check out the RVs there. Keep coming back to theprovince.com, vancouversun.com. Read all Patrick and Ben Kuzma's great stuff as we lurch towards the trade deadline and then crawl towards the end of the season.